It started the night I found the mirror. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked soil, and a distant thunder rolled like the growl of a restless beast. I'd been wandering through an estate sale, one of those old, crumbling mansions that seemed to sigh with relief when the doors were finally thrown open. Most of the items were junk, dusty porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware, but the mirror caught my eye. It leaned against the wall, its frame an intricate tangle of twisting vines carved into dark wood. The glass was flawless, almost too perfect, reflecting the dim light in a way that seemed deeper than any ordinary reflection. I can't explain why I bought it. Something about it felt alive. The man running the sale seemed relieved when I took it off his hands, muttering something about it being trouble. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. My relationship with Alex had been falling apart. The constant criticisms, the subtle jabs, and the way he always managed to turn every conversation into a debate about my shortcomings left me emotionally drained. Nights were the worst, lying awake, replaying our fights in my head, wondering if I really was as terrible as he made me feel. That night, when I finally drifted off, I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was standing in a vast, empty field beneath a churning black sky. The ground was covered in a dark, slick substance that clung to my feet as I moved. Something was in the distance, an enormous, shifting silhouette with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers. It spoke, though not in words. Its voice was a sensation, crawling under my skin and filling my head with dread.
"You will be mine,"
it seemed to say. The creature surged forward, its eyes locking onto me, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as it reached me, I woke up with a gasp. Shaking, I tried to dismiss it as just a dream, but the lingering terror in my chest was too real. That night, I hung the mirror in my bedroom. The instant I stepped back to look at it, I felt odd. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. There was a delay, a hesitation, like it was watching me rather than mirroring me. I shook it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, and went to bed. I woke up at 3:12 a.m., the exact time my alarm clock flickered and died. My room was pitch black, but the mirror, it glowed faintly, its surface rippling like water. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My own reflection leaned closer, its movements no longer my own. It smiled. I gasped, my body jolting upright in bed, my stomach twisted with unease, a cold sweat breaking out along my skin. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, clutching the blanket tightly against me. But no matter how many times I blinked or shook my head, the reflection remained, smirking, mocking me, as though it knew something I didn't. Fear and a creeping sense surged through me, leaving me paralyzed under the weight of the darkness. Suddenly, the reflection vanished. I watched the mirror for signs of movement, but none came. Eventually, I forced myself to lay back down and tried to force my mind back to sleep. That smile lingered in my mind long after I turned away, the shadows in the room seeming to ripple with silent laughter. The next day, I avoided the mirror. I covered it with a sheet, determined to ignore whatever bizarre trick my mind was playing on me. But the energy in the house had shifted. Objects seemed to move on their own. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air felt heavy, as if the walls were closing in. That night, I was in for another adventure. I was walking down the hallway of my home, the familiar creaks and groans of the old floorboards echoing in the silence. Everything was bathed in an unnatural, dim light that seemed to come from nowhere. As I passed by the mirror, I glanced at it out of habit, but my reflection was gone. The glass showed only the room behind me, empty except for faint, shifting shadows. My breath hitched as the shadows in the reflection began to move, coalescing into long, slithering tendrils that stretched toward the edges of the frame. They grew, dark and sinuous, enveloping the walls and ceiling behind me in the reflection. The air grew thick, and I felt the weight of something enormous pressing down on me. I wanted to turn away, but I couldn't. The tendrils reached the mirror's edge, and as the glass seemed to implode into itself, the darkness surged toward me. Just before it engulfed me completely, I woke up with a strangled gasp, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The fear clung to me as I stared at the covered mirror in the corner of my room. I told myself it was only a dream, but the sensation of those creeping tendrils lingered. Something primal, buried deep within me, screamed that the mirror was wrong, that it was dangerous. It wasn't a rational thought, it was instinctual, an ancient alarm system honed by evolution. My body knew what my mind refused to accept. This thing didn't belong in my home, in my life. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I would get rid of the mirror, no matter what it took. I clung to that resolve, desperate to believe it was my best chance to reclaim a sense of normalcy. When morning came, I pulled the sheet off the mirror, and my reflection, if it even was my reflection anymore, stared back with dark, hollow eyes. I reached out, compelled by some force I couldn't understand. The moment my fingers touched the glass, it wasn't glass anymore. It was cold, wet, and alive. A jolt shot through me, and I collapsed to the floor. When I opened my eyes, the mirror had returned to normal, but I could feel it. Something inside me had changed. My shadow moved before I did, stretching and twisting in ways it shouldn't. Lights flickered when I entered a room. Plants wilted at my touch, and once, when I grew angry, the mug in my hand cracked and shattered without warning. At first, I convinced myself that the changes were in my mind. I realized it was my emotions fueling the powers completely by accident. I was pacing my room, furious after another argument with Alex. My hand shot out toward a glass of water on the nightstand as if to steady myself, but instead, the shadows responded. They coiled like serpents, slithering up the side of the glass and hurling it across the room. It shattered against the wall with a deafening crash. I froze, staring at the broken glass, my heart pounding. Had I done that? The thought terrified me, but there was also something else, a flicker of exhilaration. I tried to calm myself, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. When I opened them, the shadows were still there, rippling at my feet as though waiting for my next command. From that moment, I began experimenting. I noticed that anger made the shadows lash out, violent and uncontrollable. Sadness made them heavy, pooling around me like a thick fog. Curiosity made them pliant, eager to obey my will. It was like discovering an entirely new language, one written in emotion and intention. I learned to direct them, to channel my feelings into specific actions. Then, as the days turned into weeks, the truth became undeniable. My shadow wasn't just an anomaly, it obeyed me. A flick of my wrist, and it would dart across the room, stretching impossibly far or curling into shapes that defied logic. I learned to manipulate it, practicing in secret, though I couldn't shake the sense that I was feeding something sinister. One night, in a moment of frustration, I pointed at a candle across the room. It snuffed out instantly. Shocked but intrigued, I tried again, this time focusing on the lamp. It flickered and died. My emotions seemed tied to these abilities. Anger made the shadows darker, heavier. Fear made them writhe. Curiosity made them obedient. As my control grew, so did the whispers. They started as faint murmurs at the edge of hearing, like the buzzing of an unseen insect. Over time, they became clearer, words I couldn't understand, but felt compelled to listen to. They spoke of power, of hunger, of a world beyond this one. I tried to ignore them, but they were persistent, and the more I practiced, the louder they became. I began to push boundaries. The small tricks, snuffing out candles, moving objects, felt too insignificant. One night, I tried to use the shadows to lift myself off the ground.
The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating as tendrils of darkness coiled around my legs, lifting me several feet before I lost focus and crashed to the floor. I laughed, not out of joy, but out of disbelief. What else could I do?
One afternoon, my best friend Sophie came over unannounced, as she often did. She brought coffee and pastries, her attempt to brighten my increasingly reclusive days. "You've been shutting everyone out," she said gently. "I'm worried about you." I didn't want to talk, but her presence was oddly grounding. For a moment, I felt like my old self again, laughing with her as we reminisced about our high school antics. But when she reached for the mirror, the one I'd recovered with a sheet, I froze. "What's this?" she asked, tugging at the corner of the sheet. "Don't!" The word came out harsher than I intended. The air seemed to thicken, and the shadows in the room shifted. Sophie frowned, but dropped her hand, studying me with a mixture of concern and suspicion. She'd always been my rock, my voice of reason, but now her presence felt like an unwelcome intrusion. "You're scaring me," she said. "Whatever is going on, you don't have to go through it alone." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to tell her everything, but the whispers surged, warning me to keep her in the dark. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She didn't press further, but I could tell she didn't believe me. As she left, she paused in the doorway, looking back with a sadness that cut deeper than I expected. "You know where to find me," she said softly. As the door clicked shut, a voice echoed in my mind.
"You know where to find me,"
it drawled, dripping with disdain. I froze, clutching the back of the chair for support as the realization hit me. The voice wasn't hers, it was mine. My own voice, twisted and unrecognizable, filled with a venom I didn't know I possessed. The shadows at the edges of the room rippled as if laughing, feeding on my unease. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought, but the chill lingered, sinking deeper into my bones.
After she left, I found myself pacing the room, replaying the interaction. Her kindness should have comforted me, but instead it felt like a threat. The whispers twisted her concern into something sinister.
"She'll betray you,"
they hissed.
"She'll try to take this from you."
It wasn't long before I avoided her altogether. Her calls and texts went unanswered, and when she showed up at my door, I pretended not to be home. The whispers were relentless, feeding my paranoia, convincing me that Sophie couldn't be trusted. The shadows, once a tool, now seemed to act on their own, drawing closer to anyone who dared to approach me. She had been texting me for days, and when I ignored her knocks at the front door, I thought she would give up. But Sophie, being Sophie, didn't. Instead, she climbed through the window in the back, startling me as I sat hunched over my desk, pretending not to hear her.
"What the hell?" I shouted, spinning around to see her brushing dust off her jeans, a triumphant grin on her face.
"You didn't leave me much of a choice," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm not letting you shut me out again."
The audacity of it left me speechless for a moment, but the whispers hissed in my mind, urging me to push her away. "You can't keep doing this," I snapped. "I don't need a babysitter."
"You don't get to decide that," she shot back. "You're scaring me, and I'm not leaving until we figure out what's going on with you."
I groaned, running a hand through my hair, but deep down, I knew she wouldn't back down. After a long, tense silence, I sighed. "Fine," I muttered. "Let's just go out. Maybe it'll get you off my back."
Sophie's expression softened, and she gave me a small, relieved smile. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" she teased. But as we left the house, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to ripple with displeasure, and the whispers grew louder, warning me that this wasn't over.
At first, everything was fine. We chatted about trivial things, work, her family, an upcoming trip she had planned. But then she brought up the mirror. "You've been so secretive about it,"
she said, her tone light but her eyes probing. I just want to understand. Why does it scare you so much?
I felt the heat rise in my chest, anger bubbling under the surface. I told you to drop it, I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended.
I can't drop it, Sophie said, her voice rising. You're not yourself, and it started with that thing. The whispers surged in my mind, feeding my frustration, twisting her concern into betrayal. The more heated the argument became, the more erratic the bar's lights started to flicker, casting sharp and eerie shadows across the room. I could feel the tension mounting, both in the air and within myself. The whispers grew deafening, urging me to act. Before I knew it, I had lashed out. Not physically, but with the shadows. At the exact moment my frustration boiled over, the lights went out completely, plunging the bar into darkness. The shadows coiled around Sophie's wrist like a snake and yanked her off her stool. She hit the ground hard, gasping as the tendrils pinned her down. The whispers surged, louder than ever, filling my mind with a cruel, gleeful energy. In the pitch black, I realized I could see perfectly. The shadows coiled around Sophie, gripping her limbs tightly as she struggled. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a cracked pane of glass on the wall, and my heart sank. There was a gleeful smile stretched across my face, as wide and unnatural as the creature in the mirror. That same smile from my dreams flashed through my mind, a grotesque grin etched into the darkness that haunted me. My breath hitched as I realized the connection. The smile wasn't just a memory, it was becoming me. The tendrils of darkness twisted, pulling her arms and legs at unnatural angles. A sickening crack through the room as her spine gave way, and Sophie let out a strangled cry before falling limp. The whispers cheered, their approval reverberating through my skull. I froze, staring at her crumpled form, the weight of what I had done crashing over me. The lights flickered back on, and the crowd gasped at the sight of Sophie lying motionless on the floor. People rushed to her side, shouting for help, but I couldn't move. I stood there, numb and horrified, as the shadows retreated back to me like obedient pets. I turned and fled before anyone could look at me, before anyone could see what I had become. I couldn't answer. I ran, leaving her on the floor, surrounded by strangers who had no idea what had just happened. That moment haunted me, replaying in my mind like a loop. But instead of guilt consuming me, the whispers twisted it into something darker. Before that night, there had been smaller moments. Her recoiling as the room darkened when I got upset, her shivering when the air grew cold during one of our conversations. She never said anything, but I could see the fear in her eyes. And the worst part? Some small, growing part of me liked it. I learned from the news that Sophie had survived, though barely. The coverage of the incident described the chaos at the bar, the unexplained blackout, and the terrified witnesses. Sophie was in critical condition at the hospital, with a shattered spine that had left her almost certainly paralyzed. After hearing that, I dove deeper into the shadows. I practiced in the dead of night, honing my abilities with a mix of fascination and dread. I could command the darkness to form shapes, to lift objects, even to silence the world around me entirely. I began to understand the whispers, their cryptic words unraveling into truths about the void, about the power I wielded. One night, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. If it could still be called that. The person staring back at me was no longer me. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her smile was sharp, predatory.
You're almost ready,
She said. Ready for what? I whispered.
to embrace it fully, to let it consume you.
I shook my head, stepping back. I'm not like you. The reflection tilted her head, her smile widening.
Aren't you? You've already lost everything that made you human. You just haven't realized it yet.
Her words haunted me in the days that followed. I tried to avoid the mirror, tried to pull back from the powers I'd grown so dependent on. But the shadows were everywhere. always watching, always waiting, and the whispers, they never stopped. When the final night came, I wasn't surprised. The whispers had been urging me toward this moment, preparing me. I stood before the mirror, its surface rippling like water. The shadows forcefully rushed toward the mirror, expanding and locking me in place. I couldn't move as they stretched and twisted, coiling tightly around me. Then, from the surface of the mirror, the creatures began to emerge. They formed from the very shadows that once obeyed me, their massive, shifting shapes taking form with glowing eyes that burned with malevolence. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These shadows were never mine. I had been theirs all along.
I don't want this!
I said, my voice shaking.
I don't want any of this!
But the shadows coiled around me, binding me in place. The creatures didn't speak, but their intentions were clear. I was theirs now, a vessel for their will. As the void consumed me, I felt the last fragments of my humanity slip away, replaced by something dark and endless. The whispers have become screams, the shadows a prison I can never escape. I did something to Sophie, I think. My memories are no longer my own. I can no longer separate my thoughts from those of the darkness.
And now you're listening. You've heard my story, and that's all it needs. You see, they allowed me to record this, not as a warning, but as a door. By hearing these words, you've already opened it. The whispers told me to speak, to share, to spread. They know that curiosity is irresistible, that you'll begin to notice the flickers in the lights, the too long shadows, the figure in your mirror that doesn't fully mimic you. This message isn't just a story, it's an invitation. They're watching you now, through the corners of your room, through the edges of your mind. They're waiting for you to see them, to acknowledge them. That's all it takes. I am no longer me. I am no longer anything but their vessel.
And soon, you will be too. They have noticed you now. It's only a matter of time.